Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Manuel Sferambenis. I'm the Business Development and Membership Director of Bioenergy Europe, and I would like, on behalf of the team, to welcome you all to today's webinar, the first for 2023, so also Happy New Year to everybody. Today, we are going to be focusing on the statistics for bioenergy. This is a topic that Bioenergy Europe is handling through our statistical report released every year. And today, most of you must have received already an email. If you remember, you can already download the full version of the Bioenergy Landscape Report. If you're not a member, then you must have the possibility to receive the sample version. Before we start properly with the statistics and pass my floor to my colleague Jérémie Geelen, I would like to say a few things about our association for those of you that do not know us. So Bioenergy Europe is the common voice of European bioenergy since the 90s. We bring together the national associations from the member states and beyond, plus many other companies who are part of the bioenergy value chain, whether they are technology providers, fuel producers, traders and logistics operators, or end users. We host the European Pellet Council, the network which brings together the national pellet associations in Europe. We are involved in two certification schemes, SURE about the sustainability criteria of bioenergy, and EN+, which most of you are familiar with and has to do with the pellet quality criteria. And we provide a number of services to our members, the EU policy and monitoring and influence, of course, market data, visibility networking, as well as privileged access to several events, either own, organized, or external. You can see here a nice picture of our team in Brussels in a sunnier day than today, around 25 people overall working by Bioenergy Europe from various European countries. Again, here you can see a picture of the logos of our members as of the end of last year. Already this year, we are having more and more people coming to Bioenergy Europe, and the network is ever growing. As I mentioned before, we have several companies, associations, as well as a few academic and research partners. But what does Bioenergy Europe is doing for our members? I mentioned already our statistical reports. The statistical reports is the primary source of the leading source of bioenergy statistics in 2007 when we started publication. These are publications which are exclusively available for our members, but even non-members can get a sample version if you go to our website and request a download. And since some years already, we have split the main statistical report into different chapters, if you want, or different standalone guides. One on bioelectricity, one on biogas, and one on biofuels in collaboration with the respective associations, and one on bioheat, the pellets, the biomass supply, and the final one, which is the bioenergy landscape, which aims to provide an overview of the bioenergy sector in Europe. And this is actually released, as I mentioned before, today. Many of you must be interested in the pellet markets, and one thing I have to clarify is that we are not going to be speaking about the pellet markets today, and the only reason for that is on the 15th of December we had an interesting webinar where we presented some key data from our statistical report on pellets, as well as a panel discussion with actors really involved in the pellet sector. The webinar is already available on YouTube, so if you haven't watched it, you are free to go there and get all the information that you may want. I have to mention again that our statistical reports do have sponsors. For the last years, we have sponsorships from Valmet, one of the leading technology providers of bioenergy conversion equipment in Europe, and for SGS, a leading testing, inspection, and certification company. So I have to also acknowledge their support to make these publications a reality. One other thing that we are doing, again, a service exclusively available to our members, are the working groups. The working groups are the main, I would say, decision bodies or for the information bodies of Bioenergy Europe. We use them as a space to discuss policy and market-related developments. You can already see that we have selected dates for almost all our working groups for the first half of 2023. And the topics we are covering are domestic heating, pellets, agrobiomass, wood supply from meaning wood chips as well as any kind of wood from the forest, competitiveness, which focuses on key policy files for, I would say, more the industrial sector, like the carbon tax, state aid, and so on, sustainability, where the main focus is RED 2 and RED 3. You will hear more about this from my colleague René de Paula at the end of this webinar. Carbon dioxide removals is our newest working group on the very hot topic of carbon removals and how bioenergy can really contribute to that. And a task force on national advocacy in which we communicate with national associations and aim to align our efforts in influencing the EU policy developments. So I think this is the summary from my side. A few things about the practicalities. I guess after several years of pandemic, you're mostly familiar with the Zoom platform. So please, if you haven't done so, change your participant tag to reflect your first and last name. If you have any kind of technical issue, you can use the chat or you can email my colleague Francisco, and we can help you to resolve it. And if by the end of this webinar you have any questions, you can put it on the Q&A and we'll do our best to reply to it when the time comes. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague Jérémie Geelen, who will present you the overview of the bioenergy statistics for 2022. The floor to you.
Thank you, Manolis, for the introduction. So, hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you all for joining our webinar dedicated to providing some highlights from Bioenergy Europe's statistical report published in 2022. So, as Manolis just said, I'm Jérémie Geelen, and I'm working for the Market Intelligence Department at Bioenergy Europe, and I'm the contact person should you have any questions on the data that will be presented in the next slides. So this presentation will be divided into 3 parts for the statistics, and will also include a policy-related presentation from my colleague René de Paula that will provide some insights about recent changes in the Renewable Energy Directive, for example, that could have a substantial effect on the bioenergy sector. But from my side, I'm first going to start with an overview of the European Union's energy mix, providing information on the different components of the energy system. I'll then focus more on bioenergy, of course, and how it can meet all of our needs, like transport, power, or heat. I'll then go over some data on the supply side of biomass, as well as its projected use to reach the ambitious European energy targets for 2030 and greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2050. So let's start now with the overview of the EU's energy mix. So before jumping into detailed information about fuels and different uses, it's important to understand what kind of indicators are being measured when talking about energy statistics. So here on this slide, you can see the evolution of the main energy indicators in the EU 27, so from the year 2000 until 2020. So first off, we have the gray line on the top, which represents the gross inland consumption. So this indicator refers to the overall supply of energy for all activities occurring on the territory of a country. So this one, therefore, doesn't take into account energy exports, as well as fuel used in international maritime transport, but includes the use of products for non-energy purposes. So then we have the yellow line, which represents the final energy consumption, which is the energy supplied to the final consumer. Moving on to the orange line, representing the net imports of energy. I mean, this one doesn't really require additional explanation, so it's basically energy imports. And finally, we have the primary production, which similarly presents the energy production. So there are a few interesting things to say about this graph, starting with the reduction in the gap in the last 2 decades between the gross inland consumption in gray and the final energy consumption in yellow. So this trend could be explained by several factors, such as the increased energy efficiency of our appliances, meaning that we're using less fuel to produce the same amount of energy. Then I'd like to focus on the blue line, which represents the primary production. So we can see that this value was approximately steady until 2013, where it started to decrease, with the lowest production value being reached in 2020. So this could be problematic because the local energy production in the EU is much lower than the energy needed to fulfill the needs of its consumers, and thus the EU is heavily reliant on energy imports. Moving on to a more detailed graph about the primary production. So in the EU, I just said that the overall value has been decreasing for the past decades. However, when looking at this chart, we see that the primary production is only decreasing for fossil fuels, while renewables are following a growing trend. So I'd like to focus here on the green line, which represents the primary energy production of biomass in the EU. So as you can see, the contribution of biomass has been steadily increasing, surpassing the primary production of natural gas in 2009 and surpassing coal in 2016. Making biomass really a key fuel for the European energy system. I said a few minutes ago that the primary production was way below the energy consumed by the end users in the EU, and that this mismatch had to be somewhat compensated by energy imports. As you can see here, the imports value for fossil fuels are still very high, because even though we don't produce them locally in the EU, we still rely a lot on fossil fuels to fulfill our needs. We also noticed quite a substantial drop between 2019 and 2020 for the import rate of fossil fuels, but this is more due to the COVID crisis slowing down the economy than to huge changes happening in the energy system. But all of this highlights how dependent we are when talking about fossil fuel consumption, with dependency levels of around, for example, 97% for oil and 90% for gas before COVID. And as we can see with the current geopolitical context, dependency towards others for energy needs is really not what Europe should aim for. Instead, the EU should focus on locally available solutions, such as renewables, and especially biomass, with an import rate of only 4.3% that has remained stable over the past 2 decades. So I've talked about primary energy production for fossil fuels, but now I'd like to show here the European primary energy production for renewable solutions for the last 2 decades. So as you can see, primary production of renewable energy more than doubled since 2000, with biomass being the most produced renewable energy in the EU, with more than half of the total energy production for renewables. So we've covered in the past few slides the production side of energy in the EU. But now what about energy consumption? So as we all know, the EU has set very ambitious targets with a 45% of energy consumption from renewables in 2030 and a zero emission energy system by 2050. As you can see on this chart, the contribution of renewable has more than doubled in the last 2 decades, reaching 22.1% of the mix in 2020. However, as you can also see, the fossil fuel consumption, represented here as the big gray part, went from 90.4% to 77.9%, but that still represents more than 3/4 of our energy consumption. So I just said that the EU as a whole has around 22.1% of its gross final energy consumption from renewables. But as you can see on this chart, the efforts are not evenly split among member states. With the first Renewable Energy Directive, RED I, each member state had set a target of the share of renewables that needs to be reached in the final energy mix by 2020. So those targets were part of what the Commission called the NREAPs, or National Renewable Energy Action Plans, and 26 out of the 27 member states managed to reach those specific targets. And only France, unfortunately, is lagging behind their goals, which they had set at 23% for 2020, but they only got to 19%. One important point to note, though, is that most of the countries in the top 10 have a huge contribution from biomass in their renewable mix, such as Sweden, Finland, or Latvia, for example, which underlines how bioenergy can be a great asset to reach carbon neutrality and how putting additional restriction on its use would jeopardize our progress. So we've covered previously the total energy mix, but how does the renewable consumption mix look like in the EU? So as you can see on this pie chart, bioenergy represents more than half of the renewable energy consumption, followed by wind with 15.7% and hydropower with 14.4% to finish the top three. So based on this, we can clearly state that bioenergy is currently the largest renewable source in the EU, no matter how some organization or media try to convince the public otherwise. So now I'd like to move on to the next section of this presentation, which aims at providing additional information on bioenergy, as well as on its different uses in transport, in heating, and in electricity. So first, I'd like to focus on the sourcing of the bio-based feedstocks. So as you can see on this pie chart, nearly 70% of the biomass used for energy production is coming from woody sources. So the remaining 30% are evenly split between agricultural biomass on one side and waste biomass on the other. The term woody biomass contains a lot of different materials, such as fresh wood from management operation, residues from industries, pellets, briquettes, wood chips, etc. So it's a very broad term. And additionally, in the future, it is projected that the agricultural biomass fraction will grow much bigger and reach the level of consumption of woody biomass. So while woody biomass usually means solid biomass, regarding waste and agricultural feedstocks, it can be a bit different. Indeed, one of the biggest advantages of biomass in energy is its versatility, and the fact that you can use solid biomass as it is in combustion for heating, for example, as it is displayed in green, but you can also transform it into liquid biofuels for transport, displayed in orange, or transform it into biogas through either digestion or refining, etc., to produce heating, or use it in electricity production, like it's commonly done in Germany, for example. So the difference between this chart and the previous one is that this one treats the end use, while the previous one provides more info on the types of sourcing. So if we now have a look at the evolution of the primary energy production per types of biomass, you can see that all of them have been growing steadily for the past 2 decades, but that solid biomass is still the most commonly used form of biomass for energy production and mainly for heating purposes. Indeed, one very important thing to consider when talking about energy in the EU is the fact that energy is really not equal to electricity and quite far from it, actually. Indeed, heating and cooling represents 48% of the final energy consumption in the EU, which is around twice as much as electricity or transport, both representing 26% of the mix. One of the biggest advantage to bioenergy, as I said earlier, is that it can, and also it currently is, used to provide clean energy to every use, and bioenergy is actually the only renewable to be present in each of them. Moreover, in certain uses, such as renewable heat, for example, bioenergy contributes to around 85% of the final energy consumption of renewable heating. So this chart here represents the evolution of the gross final energy consumption of bioenergy by types of end uses. And as you'll see, it has more than doubled in the past 2 decades. But I mean, this is also a trend that is verified through other indicators. So when looking at the end uses of bioenergy in 2020, we see that heat represents around 74.5% of bioenergy use, transport around 30.5%, and finally electricity around 12%. I'll now try to make a focus on each segment, but with an emphasis on heating, since it's where bioenergy shines the most, and also the biggest share of energy consumption in the EU. So focusing on heating, as you can see with the little flame icon here on the top right corner, we see on the chart that residential use of biomass is around 48% of the total, followed by industry and decentralized heating to finish that top 3. In total, the bioenergy consumption for heating in 2020 accounted for 87,485 kilotons of oil equivalent, which represents a growth of around 1.4% when compared to 2019 levels. There's one thing to note here, and it is related to direct heat. So This is heat that is being produced in CHP plants, for example, and distributed to the end user through networks, so either newly built or already existing and previously used to distribute natural gas, for example. This is particularly important in certain countries, such as Sweden, Denmark, or Latvia. And if you remember a few slides ago about the renewable shares in different member states, those countries are among the best performers, in terms of renewable shares in their energy mix. And so this tells us that decentralized heat through biomass is a very valid solution for large-scale decarbonization of heating. So as I said, the residential sector is currently the largest consumer of biomass, and this is likely to increase in the upcoming years when looking at the current situation we're facing in the EU. So here on this chart, you can see an aggregate of gas prices, heating oil prices, and electricity prices sampled from the capital cities of 10 member states. And those prices are for residential end users. So from April 2021 to November 2022, gas prices increased by 185%, electricity by 135%, and heating oil by 91%. So the prices increased in such a way because those are all fuels for which the EU is heavily reliant on imports, I mean for gas and oil. And thus there is a risk that the situation will repeat itself in case of another conflict occurring somewhere else in the world and involving one of our energy trade partners. In that specific context, biomass, with its local production, can really provide a cheap alternative that will make the EU less dependent on imports for energy consumption. However, there are still some imperfections associated with residential biomass use. So on this map, you can see the share of heating systems installed before 1992. So on this map, the greener, the better. But as you can see, several countries are displayed in a yellowish brown color. And for example, in Germany, around 36% of heating systems were installed before 1992 and have a very low efficiency. So renewing the stock of heaters in the EU would lead to first better energy efficiency, also reduction of pollutants leading to reduced danger for people's health, and also reduce costs, because with an increased efficiency, you can produce the same heat output with less material and therefore less cost. So we've just covered residential use of biomass, but now let's move on to the industrial use, which is the second biggest user of biomass for heating purposes. As you can see, and as can be expected, the two largest industrial consumers are the paper, pulp, and printing, and the wood and wood product sector. So the reason behind this is probably because of the huge quantity of woody byproducts associated with the activities of those two sectors, and that can be further used for energy purposes without relying on an external stakeholder for energy. However, there are other industries that are currently not displayed here on the chart that either have invested heavily in the past year or are planning to invest in the future to transition using biomass, such as, for example, the cement industry, the steel industry, or the lime industry. Indeed, for them, biomass is a reliable, well-known, and efficient energy source that is particularly well-suited for industrial use because, first of all, it can provide a constant load as opposed to certain intermittent renewables like solar and wind, for example. Furthermore, biomass combustion allows you to reach certain temperatures that other renewables might not be able to reach. And finally, there are also other industries looking into biomass, but sometimes not for the energy purposes, but more for the material itself and the carbon it contains. And those are, for example, the chemical industry. So now let's move on to the second sector where biomass is commonly used, which is the transport sector. So this chart here represents the evolution of the renewable energy consumption with the percentages that it represents out of the total energy consumption in transport. But I'd just like to point out that the values represented in the chart are following the calculation methodology of the European Commission for Renewable in Transport, which applies a multiplier that kind of creates additional energy out of thin air. So the real consumption values are a bit below what's displayed on the chart in terms of either KTOE or percentages. There also an additional thing to explain here is that there is quite a substantial drop in the use of renewables in transport in 2011. This is mostly due to RED I being applied in 2008 and onwards, but without proper ways of ensuring the sustainability of certain biofuels, and therefore reducing their availability and the availability of certified sustainable biomass that could be used for transport purposes. But even with those things taken into consideration, the use of renewable in transport has been growing steadily for the past years and reached its highest value in 2020 with around 10%. So renewables currently represent 10.22% of the energy consumption in transport, and here are split among renewables. So as a remark, this graph contains the real consumption values, so without the multipliers. Since those are different depending on the renewables, you need to remove them if you want to be able to compare them properly. So as you can see, 90% of the mix is composed of biofuels, which you can further divide into biodiesel and bioethanol, representing 84% and 16% respectively. This highlights once more the role of biomass as a key fuel for a green transition in the transport sector, especially for certain uses where electrification is just not possible. With this, I'm talking about, for example, aviation, but also certain industrial machines like quarry trucks, for example, that are used for longer periods of time, rendering electrification complex, and also considering that electrification adds quite a lot of weight to the transport method. So this is also something that needs to be taken into account. So moving on to the last sector, which is bioelectricity. On this slide, you can see the gross electricity generation mix. And as you can see, renewables are currently producing 93,396 KTOEs, which corresponds to around 39% of the total electricity generation, or 4% more than in 2019. When looking at the renewable mix on the right side of the slide, you can see that bioelectricity sits currently at the third place, so behind wind and hydropower. So this slide here focuses on the renewable electricity generation mix. So basically the right pie chart from the previous slide, but also providing a breakdown of bioelectricity generation. So as you can see, around half of the bioelectricity is produced using solid biomass, followed by biogas, which represents around a third of the production. So you might have heard often that electricity generation from biomass is an inefficient process and that it should be prevented. But I'd just like to point out that 72.85%, so nearly 73% of the bioelectricity being generated is being produced in efficient CHP plants that will also provide heat for other consumers. As a comparison, only 22% of the total electricity produced using conventional thermal sources take place in CHP plants. So now that we've covered each aspect of biomass use, I'd like to focus on greenhouse gases. So by substituting fossil fuels in heat, electricity, and transport, bioenergy in the EU was able to prevent an additional 289 million tons of CO2 equivalent from entering the atmosphere. So as it is, this number is not really meaningful, but when put into perspective, it represents around 8.6% of the total emissions of the EU, or around 2.6 times the annual emissions of Belgium, which is definitely something that is worth highlighting. And to wrap up this chapter of the presentation, I'd like to show a final statistics which is related to local development and job creation. As you can see on this slide, bioenergy and all of its components, so solid biomass, biofuels, biogas, and waste. So all taken together, they represent nearly 500,000 jobs, which puts bioenergy on the first place in terms of job creation. So since bioenergy relies on local bio-based feedstock, those jobs are working towards rural development and circular economy, since also the sourcing areas are mostly located outside of big cities, so it helps to develop those rural areas. And also, as opposed to some other renewables, the EU is a global leader in bioenergy equipment suppliers, with 74% of them being based in Europe. Moving on to the third chapter of this presentation, I'd like to talk about biomass projected use and supply in the upcoming years. According to the national energy and climate action plans that were developed some years ago by each member state, bioenergy is planned to keep on growing, business as usual, but in different ways based on the end use. So bioheat, which is currently the most commonly used form of biomass, is expected to grow by 19% by 2030, biofuels by 37.5%, and bioelectricity by 7%, making the total bioenergy growth to be around 20% by 2030. However, those predictions are from the NECPs, which are from 2018, and since then, a lot of things happen in the world. So following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European Commission also published a plan called Repower EU, aiming at making Europe more independent regarding its energy consumption. So even though biomass plays such an important role, as I've been trying to show for the last half hour now, this plan didn't contain any specific targets for bioenergy as a whole, but focused mainly on solar, wind, biogas, and hydrogen, which is for us extremely disappointing, since solid biomass and liquid biofuel play such a huge role in the current energy system. Oh, sorry, this is the growth. So regarding the supply side, as I stated earlier, woody biomass represents in 2020 around 70% of the feedstocks used for bioenergy, and therefore keeping track of how the forest is evolving is also really important. So I know that biomass usage and the effect it has on forests is a controversial topic, to say the least, but I'd like to provide some information that highlight the complementarity between bioenergy and forestry. So first, if we look at how the forest area and the forest stock has evolved in the past decades, we see that the total forest area in the EU has grown by around 468,000 hectares every year from 1990 to 2020, which corresponds to 1.24 football fields every minute for the past 30 years. So the area available for wood supply, so represented here with the lighter green curve, has however remained constant, which means that more forests are being set aside and not used for wood supply. Regarding the growing stock, on the other hand, which is measured this time in cubic meters and technically represents the volume of wood, we also see a strong increase, but this has lowered since 2015, and mostly due to natural causes, for example, like the reduced growth of trees the older they become. So then I'd like to address a second point that we often hear, is that forests are being harvested for energy. So this chart here is a combination of FAO data for wood removals and Eurostat data for the energy consumption of solid biofuels. So solid biofuels being mainly solid biomass and solid biomass being mainly woody biomass. So as you can see, the split between removal for industrial groundwood production and wood fuel production has remained stable over the past decades, while the consumption of primary solid biofuels, so as I said, which is mostly woody biomass, has more than doubled over the same period, which indicates that first, bioenergy is not the main driver for forest harvesting, and also that the increase in primary solid biofuel consumption is mostly thanks to the use of residues from industries, And regarding the driving force of harvesting, to make sure that bioenergy is not the driver, you just need to compare basically wood fuel prices with timber prices. And you'll notice that those are drastically different. And it makes absolutely no economic sense to burn wood that you could sell, to other industries that would pay much more per cubic meter of wood. So moving on to the policy part of the presentation, I'd like to give the floor to our policy director, Jérémie, to present some updates on EU policies.
Thank you, Jérémie, and good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, my name is Jérémie, I'm Policy Director at Bioenergy Europe, and today I will give you a quick overview on the main ongoing policy files and focus in particular on the main, I would say, legislation for our sector, which is the Renewable Energy Directive. As most of you will be familiar with, the Commission proposed in July 2021 the Fit for 55 package, because looking at the projection of getting to carbon neutrality in 2050, we noticed that we are not on track as European Union to reach our targets. So the initial foreseen 32% renewables in the energy mix by 2030 and the minus 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions were not enough to get to carbon neutrality. For this, the Commission started a big project of revision of several key directives. As you can see here in the slide, it touches upon all the sector, from electricity to building, industry, transport, forestry, you name it, everything is included in this comprehensive set of legislation. But again, today, considering also it's been already more than half an hour that we've been in the webinar, I think I will cut it short to the Renewable Energy Directive. Because again, this is indeed the main file for our sector and the most relevant one. Looking at the timeline, as I said, the first proposal came in July 2021. In the meantime, we had a little bit of everything happening because we've just experienced in the recent war in Ukraine, the energy crisis. In the meantime, the Parliament and the Council, so the two main EU co-legislators, agreed on their respective position on the revision of this file. Both agreeing on the fact that we need higher ambition, both agreeing that we need higher renewable target, but still disagreeing on certain details. And that's why right now we are in the so-called trilogues negotiations, which are a closed-door negotiation happening between Council, Commission, and Parliament to decide on the details of the revision. We just started in like 12 days ago, the presidency of the Swedish presidency of the Council. So now the Swedes are the one leading the negotiation, but this of course involves all the European member states, representative from the Parliament and the Commission. Going a bit more into detail, why Renewable Energy Directive is so important. And in particular, it is because of sustainability criteria for solid biomass. And to give you an overview on the main points that are more relevant and somehow also more concerning for our sector, here you can see a few items. In particular, as an association, we were working on the definition of no-go areas for harvesting biomass, on the details on sustainable forest management practice, support for power-only installation, retroactivity for the greenhouse gas emission savings threshold, and also the exemptions, because sustainability criteria only apply to plants above 20 megawatt thermal, and on the cascading use of biomass, for which a more strict regulation was proposed. Last, but definitely not least, with the Parliament, there was also a new proposal on the table, which is a new definition of primary woody biomass and a de facto ban on the use of that source for energy production. But what is primary woody biomass? Because this is not something that is usually and commonly used in the sector, in the market, in the academia. It's a brand new definition. And as Jérémie presented before, actually this graph is slightly outdated because agricultural biomass share changed slightly. But anyway, 70% of the feedstock used for bioenergy is woody biomass. And if we look at that, primary woody biomass accounts for somewhere between 26 to 36% of the total. And it accounts for 15 to 20% of total renewable energy in Europe, or 3 to 4% of the total energy consumption in Europe. So this is not neglectable, I will also say, and actually quite a consistent and relevant part of our energy consumption. But if we look at the definition, the problem is that the current proposal on the table doesn't look at the quality of the wood, but rather of the origin of the wood. So primary wood is all the wood that comes from forest. And if you're familiar or slightly familiar with forestry, you will notice that the wood in the picture here is either rotten, bent, infested. It's not of high value. Industry will not pay for that, and it will actually be left to rot in the forest. And this is primary woody biomass. So the proposal that is right now discussed would like to ban the use of this feedstock, which will have no other commercial use than bioenergy, to be used as a renewable energy source. And considering the times we are living in, where we do need to get rid of external dependencies to get towards decarbonization, to get to a more deep and developed deployment of renewables, this is simply hindering the market and not really providing an additional benefit, because it doesn't prevent biodiversity losses, it doesn't look at environmental impact, but it's really just a matter of where the wood comes from. So, as I mentioned before, we are, sorry, some issue with the PowerPoint as usual. We are in the hot phase, let's say, of the trilogue negotiation. So the discussion was initially foreseen to be concluded before Christmas holidays, but of course, Renewable Energy Directive is such a vast and detailed also file that the conversation was postponed to after Christmas. So right now we know that the next meetings are going to take place between February and March. And ideally, we should find a final agreement on the text and then consequent implementation at national level by end of March. So to this end, as Bioenergy Europe, of course, we've been very active, not just us, our members as well, the bioenergy sector in general. And we've been advocating to having no-go areas that allows for exception, especially based on sustainability criteria in Article 29. We also advocated for a softer language for sustainable forest management practice in order to have an indicative list of options that foresters can or cannot use, and not a mandatory list for which member states are obliged to comply with. We've also been pushing for a higher exemption threshold compared to the initially proposed 5 megawatt thermal, which is now in the Commission proposal. This is simply because if we look at entities, which are or plants that are 5 megawatt thermal, this really means very local institutions, can be a local school, can be a sport complex, can be an hospital. So those kind of entities that would really struggle to cope with sustainability criteria because of the administrative burden. So we would like this to be increased to 10 megawatt. And on top of this, we are advocating, of course, not to have retroactivity of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is to make sure that investors can trust the sector and can plan also in advance the investment made to decarbonize their industries, and on the cascading use of biomass, which is de facto already happening in the market and would just be more complicated if an implemented act was developed. Finally, I would say our main point, and probably the most important point in all of this conversation, is we've been advocating to delete the new primary woody biomass definition. How the discussion will go is still a question mark, because as I told you, things are still going on. As an association, we are keep being active, meeting policymakers, educating them about what bioenergy is and why this is fundamental, not just for the people, but for the environment, for our energy future. And I would really encourage each and every one of you also to do the same, to get in touch if you need support, and to advocate for a better future of the bioenergy sector. But since I've spoken already a lot, and today is not about policy, it's about statistics, I would like to thank you all for your attention and give the floor back to Jérémie.
So thank you, Irene, for your updates on EU policies and also for clarifying some misunderstandings revolving around the bioenergy sector. So to wrap up this presentation, I'll now present a few key messages about the situation and the bioenergy sector. So first, I'd like to start by saying that even if the EU doubled its renewable energy share in the last 2 decades, we're still consuming fossil fuels to fulfill more than 3/4 of our energy needs. And since those are heavily imported, we are very far from energy independence, and efforts need to be done to reach that specific goal. Secondly, bioenergy has a vital role to play in the European energy mix because it sits currently at the top of local energy production and is one of the only energy sources for which we could truly be independent. Thirdly, biomass provides clean energy and can help to decarbonize a lot of different uses due to its versatility, its ability to provide the constant workload, making it a very interesting fuel for energy-intensive industries, for example. Biomass is also today, and has been for the past years, the leading renewable energy source, and is expected to keep growing in the upcoming years. Then I will also say that one of the most important points to keep in mind is that energy doesn't mean electricity, and that heating represents around half of the EU's energy consumption, and therefore focusing on decarbonizing heating would provide the best results, but the political agenda unfortunately tends to look at energy like it means electricity. Speaking of policy, biomass has a negative image for some politicians and associations, but without its contribution, a lot of the member states' RED targets wouldn't have been reached. Then I'll say also that to get the most benefits in terms of health, in terms of energy efficiency and material use, the solution is to focus on the replacement of old appliances, whether they are biomass-based, like open fires, for example, or fossil fuel-based, like coal appliances, with modern and efficient installations, like those fueled with pellets, for example. And also a bit further away from the energy side, but still very much important, is the fact that bioenergy creates jobs inside of the EU, in rural areas, and works towards circularity and smarter material use. Finally, I will finish this presentation by saying that the recent years have been particularly challenging, with COVID having huge impact on our lives, with the war in Ukraine, with the inflation that we're currently witnessing. In that specific context, it is important not to lose sight of our ambitious objectives and to acknowledge that bioenergy is more of an ally than an enemy for the transition towards a zero carbon economy, and that it would be much, much easier if everyone teamed up against the main culprit of global warming, which is our excessive use of fossil fuels. Thank you very much for your attention. I see that we still have 13 minutes. So now maybe we can go to the Q&A. So
there is a question on the chat. One have already answered, is whether the slides will be available, and you can confirm that we will circulate the slides with the event participants afterwards. And there is another question, which is, I think, less about statistics, but more about the future of the bioenergy sector in the EU. And it is about the impact that the stop of the subsidies that we hear about for electricity production, mostly, for co-firing, will have an impact in the market. Perhaps this might also be a point for Jérémie as well, but if not, I might have a few things to say. So, Jérémie, you want to start?
I mean, if you have a few things to say, I might just give you the floor first, but just as a quick thing before, I think that looking at the current situation, making precise prediction is extremely complicated because it's difficult to know how the world will evolve. But yeah, stopping the subsidy for biomass for me could slow down and could scare off investors potentially. So this is already something to give an element of answer. But please go ahead, Manolis, if you want to provide with more information, or you, Jérémie.
Yeah, from as far as I understand, most of the utilities that have been using biomass under subsidy schemes are well aware of the situation, and they're already planning long term. We already see that some of them are focusing more and more on diversification of their supplies, including, for example, higher sales of agro-biomass or waste biomass feedstocks, which can lead to lower production costs. And of course, considering the current electricity prices, we might steer into a future in which these utilities might not need subsidies per se to operate under market conditions. And another thing that, again, many utilities are working on is what I mentioned before, carbon removals. So essentially, it's bioenergy power production, coupled with carbon capture, leading essentially to negative emissions. And this could open up doors, of course, for new markets and potentially also new subsidy schemes. I hope that I answered this question sufficiently.
Yes, maybe I can complement on that, specifying that indeed what we're talking about right now, it's mostly stopping subsidies for power only installation, and this is to promote cogeneration and more efficient use of bioenergy. It's not a stop of subsidies in general to bioenergy, but what I would say is still quite striking is that if we compare the unit of energy produced, fossil fuels are still getting much more subsidies, many more subsidies than bioenergy is, which I think it's at the core of this problem as well.
Good. So we have now the audience is warming up, and we have several more questions coming up at the chat. One, I think, is about the definition of the primary forest and whether this allows natural forest to be clear-cut at the time the landowner wishes to sell. I guess this is more a question for you, Jérémie.
Yes, I think here we are mixing primary woody biomass and primary forest. So I'm not sure if this is addressing the definition I mentioned before, but I guess that's the case. And this also depends on what you mean with natural forest, if it's not plantation forest, I guess, but maybe Jérémie, you can also complement on this. Forest owners can do whatever they want with their forest. The point is whether this is considered as renewable and sustainable, and whether it's supported by Renewable Energy Directive. So the perspective there is a bit different. The point that we are trying to make is that we're not, of course, talking about protected forests. Those have a very specific status, and of course, they are not used for bioenergy purposes. But it's the fact that if we have wood which is low quality and cannot stay in the forest on top of a certain amount, this could be used for producing renewable energy, and instead the proposal is now try to limiting this without any real concrete benefits for the environment. So I don't know if this answered the question, but in case you're also encouraged to reach out after the webinar in case you want to discuss further on certain details.
We have again another more policy related question. It's about the trilogues and what if you can repeat the timeline for them, and the time at exactly when the primary woody biomass and cascading will be.
Yes, so apologies for that. I didn't put a slide on this because it's relatively fresh news from these days right after the Christmas break. So the technical meetings are going on regularly. The Parliament, I think, was having one today. The Council is also meeting regularly to discuss details on transport, bioenergy, and several other issues. The political trilogues, so the next key, let's say, meeting, the next will be on the 7th of February, and then 6th of March and 29th of March. So the final trilogue should be at the end of March, but that's still a tentative date because the question mark is whether the co-legislator will find an agreement or they will struggle to do that. So we shall see.
Perfect. We have a comment about the statistics, I guess, and most of the data that you presented, Jérémie, were based on 2020, exactly, which was a bit of a peculiar year because of COVID. Can you comment a bit on what we could learn from this experience?
First, I'd like to say that the main data source for our data is Eurostat, so the European Commission Statistical Service. And so those are usually delayed by 2 years. So the 2023 editions of the report will cover 2021 data. And as you said, and this is also what I wanted to highlight at the end, is that it's extremely difficult to make prediction and conclusions based off such a peculiar year, because we've seen reduced energy consumption, reduced energy production, but without huge changes in the energy mix. It was mostly due to economical changes, slowing down of the economy, the fact that people were traveling less, people lost their jobs as well. So, I mean, this is, as you said, it's extremely difficult to make conclusions for 2020. And regarding the COVID impact on bioenergy, because I read in the chat that this is also something, I mean, sure, it had an effect, like it affected every side of the I mean, every component of the energy system. Currently, we had, as everyone is aware, quite a dramatic increase in pellet prices, but that are currently going down a bit. But sure, it's had an effect, of course, on bioenergy. This is certain.
I think that though, even though this is information that is usually not captured in statistics, the consensus of the bioenergy sector is that for the most part has been quite resilient for the COVID crisis, at least compared to others. Of course, there are hiccups like If you operate a pellet plant and you need spare parts, we all know that there have been delays in the supply chain, which obviously affecting these producers. But for the most, I would say the bioenergy supply chain, I don't think it was significantly disrupted compared perhaps to other sectors of the economy. And that I think, but the other crisis that came up after the war in Ukraine is a bit more critical, and I see that we have any question about that, and whether we see, let's say, an impact on the bioenergy sector from the war in Ukraine, how it will affect the development. So, anybody from you wants to take that?
Well, I think in part, Jérémie already touched upon this in a way, and I think the biggest impact that the war had was for sure the fact that Europe realized how dependent it was on a foreign country, Russia in this case, and the fact that they implemented the strategy, the Repower Europe plan, to get rid of this dependency and to increase local, let's say, production. The good news is that if we look at bioenergy, and that was also briefly mentioned before, most of it is produced locally, and not just the feedstock, but also the manufacturing part is mostly done in Europe. So it means that we do really have a strong European leadership in this. So I do hope, well, first that the war ends as soon as possible, and that's not needed to say even, but that we will take this as a lesson learned that we need to not only get rid of external dependency, but also to get more sustainable and renewable. So I really do hope that this will have an impact even in the future.
Yeah, apart from the policy aspects of it in the EU level, of course, have to comment that the war in Ukraine has really impacted the pellet markets in particular. We have discussed this extensively in our last webinar in December. But maybe something that will come in the future is that when the war is finally finished and the time will come to reconstruct the Ukraine's economy, we can expect that bioenergy will play a significant role. We should not forget that the Ukraine is a huge agricultural producer. There are a large untapped volume of bioenergy, especially from agrobiomass resources in the Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine will also move, it has already started moving away from Russian gas one way or another. So whether it is with district heating running on agrobiomass, new biogas plants or whatever, I think it's pretty clear that, bioenergy will have a huge part to play in the reconstruction of Ukraine.
And also, if I can just add something, it means that as you also images from everywhere online or everything, you saw the damages that were done to Ukraine's infrastructure. And in that specific situation, also there is a huge advantage of biomass, is that it's an off-grid solution. So technically you could provide heat before, I mean, you could already start reconstructing biomass appliances for residential users, for example, even if they are the reconstruction of the grid is not done. Yeah, so this is a detail, but still something worth mentioning.
I see we have a question about residential biomass use and how this is connected with air pollution, especially related to particular matter, and whether this might lead to reduced demand. Again, a topic we mostly cover in our domestic heating working group, I guess, but
I can go first and then Jérémie, you can complement if you want. No, I don't think this will bring to a reduced demand. This was also clearly shown before in the map, where you could see the age of the heating stock in Europe, which is extremely old and it's extremely worrying. So for us, one of the key points is to replace those old heating systems, being them based on fossil fuels or even on bioenergy, because if they were installed more than 40 years ago, they were for sure not efficient at this stage, with new modern systems, like for instance, pellet stoves for boilers, which have very, very little emissions and a very low level of greenhouse gas emissions, and are much more, use much less also feedstock. So I don't think this is a major concern, but it's really a matter of modernizing the heating stock, and not just for bioenergy.
Yeah, if I can comment on that one, the issue is not so much that air pollution will lead to reduced bioenergy or biomass demand. It's the issue of how this demand is being used. Increased biomass demand for the residential heating these days is coming because of the high fossil fuel prices. This is clear, and we have seen that in many countries this leads to increased firewood demand. Some countries have implemented bans on firewood export, for example, a few even on pellet exports, for example. So it leaves a very complicated situation. And there is a possibility, a fear, if you want, that governments might respond to increase pollution from improper appliances like open fireplaces by implementing blanket measures which could let's say, cover also the higher efficiency and less polluting biomass devices. This is, of course, the role of Bioenergy Europe on the EU level and of the national associations on the member state level to make sure that, yeah, the policies are properly implemented and that we don't have this kind of situation. There is, I think, a question about the role of bioelectricity, if I understand it correctly, in electricity generation and whether this is used as a peak power production or more as a, let's say, base load operation. My understanding, at least, of the situation is that most of the biomass power plants, I'm talking about the solid biomass power plants, operate for various reasons as base load units. For the most part, there are several reasons for this. One, some are more technical. It's, let's say, any kind of electricity power plant that is using solid fuels, whether it is biomass or coal, is usually better operated on a base load basis. The other reason, I would guess, is also having to do with what we discussed before on the subsidies. If you are getting subsidies to operate your biomass power plant, of course, it makes sense to operate more rather than less, if possible. I hope that we have answered this question. We have also a comment about that it's not logical to stop subsidies for biomass power only production because there are countries like where me and Irene are coming from, Greece, Italy, Spain, I guess also, and others where the heat demand is low and then there is little possibility to implement CHP plants. I don't know, Irene, is this something that you think the policymakers realize in Brussels? Has it been brought up?
That's something that we tried to make them realize, in the sense that we conveyed the message that indeed most of the cases power-only plants are due to local conditions and the fact that it's not economically or viable to have a cogeneration plant instead of a power-only plant. And that's also why now we have some exceptions anyway in the proposal, which do consider the lack of infrastructure or the fact that indeed the local conditions don't allow in a convenient way as well to have a cogeneration unit instead of a power-only plant. So I think this is indeed quite relevant for Mediterranean countries where the heat demand, especially commercial heat demand, is lower, and such investments might not make sense.
I would agree, and I have worked in the past in such cases where you have, for example, big potential of agrobiomass from prunings, for example, in regions where the heat demand is simply not there, with some special exceptions maybe, where it would make perfectly sense to convert this biomass and produce electricity for which there is always a demand. And actually, if you consider the electrification targets, there will be even higher demand in the future.
Exactly.
Perfect. So I think that's we have covered most of the questions from the chat, and anyway, the time is coming to close this meeting. So I would like to thank again Jérémie and Irene for their participation, for their insights and their presentations. I mentioned before that this is the first webinar of the year, and we actually have one in 2 weeks from now on the topic, the very hot topic of carbon removals. Some of you may be aware that in December, if I'm not mistaken, the European Commission published its first proposal for certification of carbon removal schemes. Bioenergy-related solutions such as BECCS and others are prominently featured, others not so much, unfortunately. So on the 26th of January, we're going to be having an event where we will present in more details the Commission's proposal, and how different options can be implemented. We can put the link in the chat, and we can send it also to all the event participants afterwards, along with the presentation slides. Again, many thanks for your involvement and for your participation, and good afternoon to everybody.